Thank you so much, Sharada, and good afternoon, everybody. And I do have to take a moment. I am smiling because there are so many friends that I see on the screen, people that I've had the privilege of working with and learning from throughout my career. And it's just so good to see so many of you. And I would name you, but I won't because you know who you are, and we'll talk during the chat. So just thank you for being here. The other promise that I made to Sharada and the team as we were planning for this is to follow some advice that a mentor gave me many years ago, and that is to follow the 3 B's of any good public speech, and that is to be good, be brief, and be gone. So I'm going to try to hit at least 2 of those, and we will get into the details of what we're going to discuss this afternoon. And I also want to compliment you on the fact that you're having this discussion. Certainly in the past year, and a little over a year now, we've experienced so many things in society in addition to the pandemic that has really shown a bright light on so many of the societal issues, key among them being race. And it takes a level of courage to have candid conversations, to hold space for those conversations, but also to learn how to have them, the skills that we can develop, the ways that we can educate ourselves about it. So before I begin, I do work at Northern Trust, and I've been there for several years and have worked in several businesses at the firm. I moved into this role, and my background was in finance. So I moved into this role, CSR, as well as global diversity, equity, and inclusion several years ago. So having a background that really came from the business and less HR focused allowed me to have a strategic view of what it means to lead diversity, equity, and inclusion, as well as to help move our institution through the work that we've been doing for over 30 years now on diversity when we've added now equity and inclusion. And we'll get to that a little bit later on in the discussion. But I chose to open the discussion tonight with a quote from Nelson Mandela. You cannot have an impact on society until you have changed yourself. So often when I have the conversations at work and we talk about how we can become better able to have these candid and sometimes challenging conversations around race, around equity, around justice, it's so important that we first begin with ourselves, that we understand where our opportunities for growth are, where the levels of discomfort are, and how we can navigate through that in the best way. So I ask you this evening, as we have this discussion, certainly to ask your questions, to be as candid and comfortable as you can be, because there are no questions that are dumb. There are no questions that are inappropriate. And the guidelines that we have for having this discussion will allow us to engage in ways that hopefully will open you to hearing and listening and learning more about ways that you can have discussions that are uncomfortable, but that then will move us towards higher levels of justice and equity for all people, but specifically as we talk about racial inequities and ways to address that. On the next slide, I'm showing the definitions that we use at Northern Trust to talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And as you see here, we talk about the imperative of embracing who we are. You'll often hear the phrase when we talk about it in the corporate context or in the work context, bring your whole self to work. Now, that can mean different things to different people. And certainly navigating through the pandemic and the environment where we've all learned to work remotely, bringing our whole selves to work has become a bigger challenge, but it's led to other opportunities for us to be able to think of ways to leverage the diversity. The second word is equity. And I distinguish equity from equality in the following way. It's about fairness of access, opportunity, and advancement. Equality assumes that we all start from the same place, that we all need and have the same things in order to achieve success. Equity acknowledges that we do not, that there are certain systemic and structural things that preclude people of color, people who are differently abled from achieving levels of success because of systemic and structural issues. So equity is key to that. And inclusion. It's really the act of creating an environment where any individual or group can feel welcomed, where people can thrive. So I generally explain it this way. Diversity is being invited to the dance. Inclusion is being asked to dance. But equity means I get to choose the music to which I dance. A little over 3 years ago at Northern Trust, we embarked on a refresh of our diversity, equity, and inclusion strategy. We looked at data and recognized that for underserved groups, we were not getting the representation that we needed. And so we did a lot of work that I'll talk about later on in the presentation of how we got there to get into this conversation talking about race. And I'll leave you with some tips, tools, and techniques that you can use as you have these conversations, not just in your workplaces, if you're still working in an organization, but also with family, with colleagues. I think the heightened level of conversation that we're seeing now as a result of what has happened, whether it was with the killing of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, all of these things that have happened in our society, how are we able to have the conversation? How do we get to a place of being comfortable with being uncomfortable, which is really the crux of the work that I've been doing for the last several years. So nomenclature is critical to what we do. And I've said to people, for those of you who are familiar with the Star Wars series, that I want to become a Jedi, as one of my friends referred to it, committed to justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. So my goal as I do this work is to help create other Jedis in doing the work, because there is an economic imperative, a business imperative, and outcomes for all of us when we're able to understand what has happened historically, put that in appropriate context for the implications that it has on society today, and what that means for how our businesses, our organizations are impacted by it. Some of the common challenges that are shown on the next slide that can limit the impact of initiatives to address racial disparities and inequities. When we were putting together our strategy at Northern Trust, there were several things that we wanted to look at. And key among them was to have a quantitative and a qualitative view of what the things that we were seeing visibly around representation really meant. And so we started with looking at the data. This is the Financial Executives Organization, and it is important we all look at data. We work with data. We look at what it can tell us, the stories, what patterns are developed, what are some of the strategic things that we can do to affect or influence an outcome. So we did quantitative and qualitative views of it. The quantitative piece was really looking at data. We had an hypothesis that said that we believe that movement within our organization was correlated in many ways to advancement, to greater job opportunities, and so on. But we had to test the hypothesis. And so what we did was we looked at one area. If we were going to look at movement, because we believe that that was one of the ways that people were able to advance in the organization, get access to different jobs that then better prepared them for movement and advancement, we looked at how people were moving. So we looked at 4,000 moves over 4 years within our organization, all of the data. We looked at it by race, ethnicity, and gender to determine if what we thought was true. And then, if it were true, what levers could we pull to impact that outcome? How would we then be able to ensure and do the work that would allow us to say, if we're looking, for example, at women, what do we need to look at in terms of movement? And what we found from that data was that men were certainly being advantaged by moves. And what we further found was that these were something we refer to as manager-initiated moves. That the role that I got was because many of you have heard the term, you were tapped on the shoulder. You know, someone came to me and said, okay, Connie, this is a good opportunity for you. And so it is a way of us to think about how do we then manage that process without artificially doing anything, but it caused us to acknowledge that there were parts of the system that we needed to address in order to affect better outcomes. And one of the things that we did was that we did look at hiring. How are we in terms of recruitment, and what are we training our recruiters to do in the marketplace? How do we help our leadership teams understand what it means, diverse slates, diverse interview panels? And I'm often asked the question when I talk about the diversity, equity, and inclusion work that we've done, well, if you talk about equity in that context and the work that you're doing, does it in some way diminish the quality of talent? Depending on how that comes across, I call that the soft bigotry of low expectations. Because if we increase the diversity in our organizations, it in no way implies that we're hiring or recruiting subpar talent. So agree with me, if you will, or at least entertain the idea that we are not lessening standards in any way. We are removing obstacles and barriers in order that people might have access to opportunities that they wouldn't otherwise, because perhaps where they went to school, or the people who know them, or their access to opportunity. That is one of the things, though, the behaviors that needs to change. So we did that work. We went through the entire process. The qualitative piece was we conducted small group focus groups with our employees around the world. At Northern Trust, we have 20,000 employees whom we call partners. And we conducted focus groups with them to learn their lived experience. And you'll hear that term when people are talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion. What is it like to be a Black person, a Latinx person, a woman, a person with disabilities at the organization? And we learned from those focus groups what were some of the things that our partners were concerned about and what we could do then to address that. And I won't go through the entire strategic process and what we did, but the outcomes from all of that work was that we had 3 specific outcomes that we were going to do: accountability, enhanced training and development, and culture. And accountability meant that we had to use the data that we gathered and that we had about our businesses in order to allow those leaders to know what the implications were for their businesses: representation by gender, by ethnicity. And the groups that we were focusing on were Blacks, Hispanics, and women in that order. So those 3 outcomes: accountability, training and development, and culture. And you've all heard the phrase, I think it's culture eats change for lunch, or something to that effect. And so that culture piece is critical to what we had to do. So we've already established a myriad of ways that we are looking at to really address the change in culture. One of the most challenging aspects, I'd say, of the work to be done. So that awareness and understanding. We developed a diversity, equity, and inclusion knowledge site where we have TED Talks, we have book summaries, all of those things where our partners can go and get information. Our team has conducted conversations in small groups with a little over 6,000 of our employees, and probably more than that at this point, in order that we can have conversations like the one we're talking about tonight about race. Now, we're a global firm, and race in other countries doesn't have the same meaning or context. So we are culturally specific when we have these conversations, but tonight our conversation is focused on the United States. And so I'll talk about it from that context of race. That commitment to sustainable and impactful solutions. That's tying into it. Sure.
Sorry, really quickly. I'm hoping before we kind of move too far away from the point, there's been a question on equity versus equality. So I would really like to lean in on this, because this is one that comes up quite a bit when we talk about hiring and the whole concept of if we're hiring to make sure that we're achieving diversity standards, how do we make sure we are still getting the best person in the seat? And I love the way that you articulated it, that but if you could maybe lean in a little bit more around maybe some of the bias or some of the things that get in our way when we consider that immediately that diversity means subpar, or diversity means not the best fit for the role. Can you lean in on that a little bit more for us?
And I'd come back with a question. It is a reflection of bias or a view or perspective that somehow when you see diversity, you see less than. See, when I see a diverse person, I don't see a lack of skill or ability, or when I'm presented with someone to interview, I don't assume that because they are a woman, a person of color, or a person with disability, that they're lacking in ability. And so it means that if we are not able to allow diverse individuals to have job opportunities, because we don't believe that they can pass muster, if the systems, the interview panels, and the interview process is equitable, you would naturally weed out anybody who isn't qualified. This is not, we're forcing any organization to hire people who are incapable or incompetent. This is saying that we have pools of talent that we have not allowed to have opportunity in certain roles, and therefore organizations don't have the benefit of that talent. And generationally, when we look at Gen Z, they want to work for companies that have opportunity for them, and that they have companies that are diverse. And so it doesn't mean there's any diminution in capability or qualifications. It means that we need to do the work to ensure that we're bringing the proper talent to the table, and we're not just always looking in the same spot.
And do you tend, Connie, there's another question here that I think it fits in. Do you think that cultural fit sometimes plays a role in choosing certain individuals over other individuals because people are more comfortable from a cultural fit perspective?
Well, it's a fact that most of us are most comfortable working and being with people who are like ourselves. And culture is an interesting word. I think about it not so much in terms of the anthropological context, but in the context of culture is how things get done in organizations. And you're right, this notion of fit. It becomes a problem when we say that the construct for success at our firm looks exactly like this, because then you don't even allow for the benefit of diverse thought. And that's another way. And I don't mean cognitive diversity, which is a different thing, but then you're not even allowing for the benefit of diverse thought, but culture, which is why that was one of the top 3 outcomes in the work that we're doing, because culture has a way of shutting down and eliminating. And there are behaviors and things that happen. What school did you go to? And I'm not suggesting that there's anything about saying we have a certain standard for skills that we want from people. But how do you then look at those institutions and other institutions that you might not have considered from which you can recruit talent? So there are ways to do that. But the culture piece is difficult. The culture piece means that the very senior executives of the organization first need to agree, or at least allow, that there are challenges and gaps. And when you look at data, as we did, you can see where there might be certain areas of the organization where there are opportunities to help shift the culture. I see a comment that says the U.S. military has struggled for years with this concept. First, it was the blacks, and no way. And you're right. And so that is these institutions and structures that are looking for a way to exclude people, and that is very, very clear. Can we lean into it? Sure. In terms of leaning into how do we get around that, the culture piece, it's being very specific. We sat down with our management group to talk about what we heard in those qualitative interviews, the lived experiences of people. And it is moving beyond, well, show me what their rating is. This was not about the disgruntled employees or those who are poor performers or anything of that sort. High performing people who feel uncomfortable being who they truly are at work for fear that they might not succeed. And I don't mean anything other than being who they are. A Black person, a Latinx person, a woman, an LGBTQ person, when the environment is such that I can't be who I am at work. And it doesn't mean anything other than saying that as a Black person, my story, my culture is different from yours. It's not a good or better. It's how do I understand what is needed? And in the context of the company strategy. If at the end of the day, we want the best talent to drive our strategy, to help ensure that we are profitable and sustainable, we need to look at all the talent. And that is very important to us. And that requires shift in thinking. It requires additional training. How do you address culture when it seems uncomfortable or threatening? First and foremost, it is important to understand that the support has to come from the top. And then you hear people talk about the frozen middle, those who don't want this shift or change to happen, because it in some ways might threaten what they believe is their leadership or their power or what they're most comfortable with. So an organization has to agree that there's a challenge and an opportunity. And what we did was, with the support of our CEO, he and I partnered on this with my DE&I team, HR, and then really talking to those senior executives. And I'm not saying by any means this is easy. We're not done. This is a process that will go on. When I look at back where we were 30 years ago to where we are today, the word equity would not have been included in our conversation. People talked about diversity. So it has to start out by saying there is a challenge or an opportunity or a problem that we need to fix. If we see only certain people being promoted or given opportunities, that's a problem for the corporation, for the organization. And sooner or later, you will not have access to talent. Our clients expect us to have inclusive practices and behaviors. The requests for proposals that we get, our vendors, our suppliers, they look at us and we look at them for those behaviors. So it isn't just now only for the organization. Are there other questions relative to that? Most boomer age white people.
Going.
Yeah.
Oh,
okay.
Go ahead. Yeah.
Most boomer age white people do not realize the existence of white privilege, and systemic racism. We also do not know how much about the history of slavery, Reconstruction, Jim Crow, the civil rights movement. How do we educate boomers, or do we just move on to the following generations? That is such an excellent question. I am not one who gives up easily. And certainly in this work, I say I have a PhD in resistance, but I'm also wise enough and have lived long enough to know when it is time to say that is as far as we can go with that. But I would challenge each of you and each of us, when I talk about educating ourselves, Reconstruction, Jim Crow, there's so many good books, TED Talks, all kinds of information you can get, because as I said with that opening quote, it's about educating ourselves and being willing to hear or learn some things that might challenge your own biases, your own views and beliefs that may have been long held, your family structure, the way that you grew up. But it is so important to take that effort. And what we're saying and the work we're doing is that it's no longer acceptable to do that. And while we can't get to every single person in our organization who might have those views and beliefs of wanting to hold people back, we're going to have at least enough accountability metrics, data, engagement with people that we can find where those behaviors are rigid, unmoving, and we will have to make decisions about that. So I'll move to the accountability tied to coordination and implementation. It really is the accountability piece. You probably have seen, if you track these things and read them, lots of companies are tying compensation to the outcomes of DE&I strategy. That's one way to do it, certainly having that part of the work in expectations, but it's all of those things combined. And you have to know your own organization and entity as to the pace. But it is important not to be frozen because it's hard, because it is hard. It is hard, it is frustrating, it can make you uncomfortable. All of those things will come to play. But it is important to be strategic in your thinking about how you want to move forward for impact, because the world has changed. There are things that are happening relative to climate change that is affecting migratory patterns. How do we look at and think about that in terms of a diversity discussion? Because that is real as well. How do we look at our investment vehicles from an environmental, social, and governance perspective? Those things that can impact outcomes and inclusion. But I do want to get to the part of our discussion where we talk about how do we do this? How do we have difficult conversations? How do we have those uncomfortable conversations that so many of us have? And I ran across some research that I thought was really good, because really got to the point of what are things that we can do immediately. Check your own bias is the first one. Where are the areas in my life that I'm unwilling or unable to change or see differently? And you've probably heard people talk about unconscious bias, and there are over 200 types of biases. But unconscious biases, whether it's selection bias or my preference for a certain kind of person in a certain role. When you think about financial services or portfolio manager roles or strategy roles, just what do you picture as a person in that role? And if the first thing that comes to mind is a white male, that's because typically that is what we see in those roles. So we check our biases, think about those things that might cause us not to be open to what might be different, or that which we've not seen before. And there's lots of research and work that you can get and look at to think about how you can change that behavior. Because no matter what your race or ethnicity, we all have some bias about something. And it's important to really consider what those are and take the time to think about it. There's an implicit bias assessment that you can take to learn where you are on that scale, with recommendations as to how you can move forward. And I also often get the question, what if people are just not interested? I always say only the creator can change a heart. My job is to try to at least put something on your mind that will allow you to entertain the idea that there is a different way of being. The second is to set guidelines, boundaries, and goals. The discomfort around these types of conversations in dealing with race really do stem from uncertainties where a conversation could lead to negative outcomes, emotions, people just really having a tough time. And one of the key things, and it's a phrase that I use, is creating a safe space like we have this evening. Being comfortable asking your questions, knowing that it isn't about judgment. It is really seeking to understand. It's being comfortable, not saying that when people start to get angry, we don't want them to be angry. That's not fair to anyone. So we don't want that. But the natural emotional response to an issue that might come up for me as a result of the conversation, the most that I can do is hold space for you, because it is not appropriate to try to turn the feelings off. That's someone's lived experience. And the third is to start on common ground. When I talked before about educating ourselves, find a book, a podcast, some way that you can educate yourselves. It is not the responsibility of your Black friends, your Latinx friends, or your female friends to tell you what it feels like all the time. The best conversations come when you come with at least some common ground or basis for understanding, to ask your questions, because certainly it is important. We want to be able to look at various topics, understand beliefs and views, but that begins with me being willing to do the work around trying to understand different perspective and have a common ground from which we can have a conversation. And 4, turn to facts. I talked earlier about the work that we did that was quantitative, get the data. And so for in these conversations, when we turn to facts, it is important that I not make broad statements like all men do this or all Black people do this. That's a generalization. It is important to understand from a fact basis. If we look at what happens with health disparities, there is research that shows what happens to Blacks and Latinx people in the healthcare system. Research done right here in Chicago, some work that was done on the West Side that we were involved in at Northern with Rush Hospital, that shows the life gap between people who live in certain zip codes and those who live in other zip codes. And that gap is, I think it was around 8 years if you lived in certain parts of this city versus other parts. Those are facts. That way we can then come to good, comprehensive solutions. And I know in the chat there is information on the implicit bias test. There's also the intercultural development inventory. I've been certified in delivering that tool, where it looks at cross-cultural competence. It's a good tool. And then agree to disagree when necessary.
And quickly, Connie, before we move on to just one question that I think fits with the turn to facts. There was a question around how does one measure if an organization or company or school has diversity or equity? So how do you know if you're not diverse or you're not equitable?
Well, the easy answer is you can look around. You can see whether there are one type of people, only one type of people or race or ethnicity versus another. But I go back to the facts. Get the data. If you look at who attends an organization or attends a school or who is in an organization, get the facts and the data. And you will know then whether or not you have more Blacks, Latinx, or women, or whatever that might be. You have to be willing to, it's important to be willing to do the work to look at what that is. The equity piece then says, based on population representation, if the population is, let's say, if 50% of our employees at Northern Trust are women, then it would stand to reason that at least 50% of the opportunities that come up, women should have access to those. And so you want to look at the data to make that decision. And then I think we move to agree to disagree when necessary. Yes, we know that everyone is not going to agree when we have these conversations about race. There may be many of you or some of you now who are listening who have very strong feelings about that, and that is okay. It's what we do with that. It's what our intention is as we have the conversations to really open ourselves to think differently about things that may have worked for some very well in the past, but knowing that going forward, it does not allow for a sustainable or a just society. We hear people, and I know I do, people talk a lot about the business case for diversity, equity, and inclusion. I think it's been made. And if you want the research, whether it's McKinsey or anyone else, but I talk equally as much about the moral case. Why should I, as a Black woman, have to justify my very existence in this country, in this city, or in a company? Certainly there are things that I need to have in order to be able to participate in the corporation, skills, all of those things. But all of those things being equal, the moral case is I should not have to work any harder or be denied an opportunity because of my race or ethnicity. And number 6 is interesting. Use FFF statements, not Yeah. FFF statements simply mean I felt, I found out, so now I feel. Because it is important. And it might be uncomfortable for those of us who are more inclined to think about things in a less emotionally connected way. We are fact based, we say, we are driven by data, we make decisions based on facts, but we're also human. And so it is important to, when we're having conversations about race, that we express our feelings in a way, knowing that they've evolved over time and they can evoke emotions. So when you're having that conversation, I can say, I feel uncomfortable when groups start to tell jokes that are demeaning to women or other groups. And I found out that there is a way for me to engage in a conversation, to diffuse that, to remove myself. And now I feel better because I have a strategy and a way of making that happen. And then actively listen. My mother always said that God gave us two ears and one mouth so that we can listen twice as much as we speak. But listening is a very, very important skill to develop. Most people are talking most of the time or thinking what they're going to say next. I ask my mentees, are you listening or waiting to speak? Are you listening or waiting to speak? And there was a quote that I heard that I just want to share with you around listening that I thought was so important. It says, deep listening is the kind of listening that can help relieve the suffering of another person. You listen with only one purpose, to help him or her to empty their heart. That is important. And that's a skill that has to be developed if we're going to do this work well. And resist the temptation to not let people finish their thoughts. That is important. I went through those 7 very quickly, but I think those are some ways that you can really engage and have a conversation, to think about it before you engage in the conversation. And perhaps practice or have conversations with people with whom you are most comfortable. But it will be uncomfortable. And there are still times when I'm having conversations with people where I'm adapting and adjusting, never backing away, because I've learned and I've trained to lean into those conversations. Someone said in the chat, listen with all 5 senses. But it's an aerobic activity. And it's just the notion of, this is not everybody loses or everybody wins. There has to be this way of looking at these uncomfortable but important conversations, because it does have economic impact. It has societal impact. And at the end of the day, it impacts us as human beings and how we feel about how we show up in the world. And the last slide here is one from James Baldwin, who says, not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. And so by us having these uncomfortable conversations, thinking about ways that we can develop skills to listen to one another, strategies for having the conversation, being deliberate in our organizations and institutions to look at data and facts to drive strategy that will then impact our bottom line. I think that is a way forward. And I think it is an opportunity and something that we will continue to do. So thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
That was great, Connie. I do have 2 questions that came up in the chat that I want to make sure we get to. The first one is relative to your clients. Do you bring the same general strategy and approach around how you think about DEI, data, fact-based, and then also the uncomfortable conversations strategies that you laid out? Do you bring those to your relationships with your clients as well?
Without question. And actually, our clients come to us and say, if we're going to do business with you, we want to understand what your strategy is around diversity. We want to know what the governance structure is from your board of directors, the specific questions around how diverse is your board, and our board is diverse. How diverse is your staff? How diverse is your senior leadership? So not only do they want us to bring the conversation, they want us to bring the facts. And I've done numerous and continue to do, as does my team, meetings with our clients. So that is out there, and it's very clear that that is of interest to them.
And one other thing, maybe taking that a little further, when you think about the impact that Northern Trust is having in the Chicago area community, who you work with, who you lend to, how you partner with Chicago as a community, how do you view Northern Trust's commitment to benefiting the community at large around DEI?
Our commitment to our community is a core part of who we are as a firm. Our core values are service, expertise, and integrity. And part of that service is to our clients, certainly, but it's also to our communities. And I'll give an example. When the PPP loans were being given out and small businesses and others were getting that information on our community investment team, which I lead. One of the things that we did was we led a strategy that allowed us to provide $100 million in PPP funds to community development financial institutions. And CDFIs actually provide support to many areas in our city and our community that were most impacted by what happened over the past summer. Secondly, our foundation, we make grants. We've also made grants and contributions to the various initiatives around the city where we're trying to help improve quality of lives and the way that our communities engage with us. One of the things that we did early on from a community investment perspective was we invested in social innovation bonds. We've made social innovation bonds in terms of our community investment practice that really deals with societal issues, and it's a alignment between a nonprofit organization and us as a funder to that, where we then can address those issues. And the first one we did was here in Chicago that addressed early childhood education. We knew that young people coming from underserved communities would have a more difficult time being at level when they started kindergarten. So we worked with various community entities and organizations so that those children would be ready when they got to kindergarten, so that they were able to read and do all of the things that are necessary. So our commitment to this community and all of the communities where we have a footprint is critical. And we do it not just with our investment of dollars, because that's important, but many of our partners serve on various nonprofit boards around the city of Chicago and around the country. That is core to who we are, and it is critically important.
There's a couple more here that I'll share. So one is around, again, I think leaning in around the equity versus equality. So the scarcity mentality that if we need to make more room for others at the table who maybe didn't have equal opportunity or equal access to opportunity, doesn't that mean less for me? And what are some talking points or ways to help address that in those tough conversations?
And I go back to if we look at where opportunities are, who gets the opportunities, and it's not a zero-sum game in terms of trying to divide up a pie that's traditionally been unequally divided. It is important that we are clear that we're not going to have more of the same. For one, when you look at the talent that's available, by 2040, research says there will not be one dominant race in this country. And so if you look at talent development and access to talent, that's one aspect of it. If firms want to be competitive, that is a fact about what is happening in this country, developing the talent. We want to make sure we have access to all of it. There is nothing that's going to make I can say that's going to make an individual comfortable who does not believe that equity is something that should happen versus equality, because we all don't start from the same place. It is not appropriate, or it is suboptimal to suggest that an individual who has never had an opportunity to have access to a role, that they shouldn't get it because they never had access, because there wasn't a system or a structure that made that possible or probable. So it's being comfortable with being uncomfortable about the prospect that we're going to broaden this talent pool because it's there. That's the only way we're going to be able to successfully grow our businesses, and to be inclusive about it.
And I think maybe one of the things that really resonates, if there is no one dominant race by 2040, this isn't really about competitiveness. It's almost about being alive in 2040 as a business. If you're not fishing from the whole pond, so to speak, and you're not really leveraging access to the broader pool, you may not exist as an organization.
And that fact makes some people uncomfortable as well. Mm-hmm. But it is the reality of what is happening around the world, actually.
Sure. And then another question from Sherry Franklin here. So she says, we're leaders here and want to have an impact. I know you to be impactful and always have been so. Fearlessness. And it's the fear that often stops people from going forward, bucking the cultural systems. You did this early before it was popular. Where did your fearlessness come from?
Hey, Sherry, good to see you. And thank you for that question. Probably could be a little insanity. I don't know. No, but really, it was a couple things. Number one is I grew into this And the more I did the work, the more I understood that if I didn't do it, then I wasn't being true to myself. But I've also had support. None of us is self-made. I don't believe that in any way. So it was people who supported me in my career, having allies, and that's important as well. It is important to have allies, and that means white males as allies. All of those individuals who believe that and know and have done the work to know this is important, that it has impacted and it affects the performance of companies. It can impact your competitiveness if you are not inclusive, diverse, and practicing your business equitably as it relates to your talent. So it is allies. It is people who have joined with me. It is making the case for it and then saying, yeah, this makes sense. So it is first my own belief and view that I'm worth more than the value of what I can produce, having the courage to know that I am put here to do something, and that something for me has to do with, yes, how do I benefit the corporation that I've been with, this one in particular, for a long time, but then how do I help other people? And that means all people certainly, but this conversation is about race, Sherry, and what's most important is sometimes you just have to walk out there in it. And I will say that it certainly means that, yeah, there could have been times when I could have been fired or moved around, but I've experienced the dystopia of racism and sexism and classism. And I, for one, don't want other people to have to experience that. So it is natural for me to do that, and having allies and other people coming along to do that. And I'm encouraged many times because there are so many people who want to assist in this work.
Sharada, this is Skip. Can I ask a question verbally? Is that okay?
Yep, absolutely.
This has been a fabulous conversation, Connie, and I'm gonna put you, this is an uncomfortable conversation, so I'm gonna put you on the spot a little bit, and I'm gonna give you an out in advance that you don't have to answer if you don't want to or uncomfortable. I've been around 40 plus years at the Chicago market. I'm going to pick on Northern Trust for a moment. If you thought about 40 or 50 years ago, the most white bread institutional, the gray lady of LaSalle Street, okay? Let's pick on the Northern Trust for just a moment, please. Go back 50 years ago, and I want to do a scale of 0 to 100, okay? 0 is completely undiverse, white bread, privilege, you know what I'm talking about. The other end of the scale is 100. 100% diverse, 100% everything. Let's agree 50 years ago that Northern Trust was a 0. Ready for the big question and where this is heading?
Go ahead.
Where do you think Northern Trust is today? Now, I won't tell the boss, and you don't have to answer if you don't want to, but I think we'd all like to hear for organizations like yours, where do you think you are? And I'm going to come up with my own guess. Everybody should guess in their mind. Again, 0 to 100. Where do you think Northern is? I won't tell you my guess, but I think I'm going to come up with my own number. And are you comfortable with coming up with your own number on a scale of 0 to 100?
Actually, Skip, I get asked that question quite frequently.
Okay.
I wouldn't be able to do this work if we weren't looking at ourselves carefully, critically, both, like I said, quantitatively and qualitatively. And so 50 years ago, you're right. I've been with the firm for 28 years. So I have seen a lot of it. I started when
the Smith family, this was as white bread as you could imagine. Oh my God. The Smith family with Northern Trust and ITW and the whole thing, you know.
Certainly. Okay. And that is how most corporations, quite frankly, looked 28, 50, 30 years ago. And so that is part of it. They started the business. But the fact of the matter is, on a scale of 1 to 100, there is no 100 company. The world is too dynamic and changes. If anybody were to say to me that they are at 100, meaning they have solved it all, I would not engage in that conversation, or I'd ask some very probing questions. And I want to see the data, because it's different for every organization and every institution. It is not a one size fit all. There are some basic facts and frameworks that you need to have to do that, certainly, but I don't know of a 100 company. And you read the Wall Street Journal and other publications just like I do to know that along the way, each company is going to have its issues. But where Northern Trust is today, I'd say we're probably at 90%. We have an African-American chief financial officer. The head of our Northern Trust Asset Management business is an African American, and that's a $1.2 trillion business. Our board has significant diversity, race, ethnicity, and gender. This is all intentional. I report directly to our CEO, so he knows that I do these all the time. So there isn't a turn of phrase or anything that I've said that he and I haven't talked about. And I think it is that partnership that has allowed us to really advance, and Bill Osborne before him and Rick Waddell before him. And so we have moved along that continuum. And a lot of it is mirrored by the lived experience of that CEO. You know, what we are is where we were when. All of us have different views and beliefs. So that is not, thank you for the question, happy to answer it. And we have work to do. I was the first.
And I'm just curious for everybody listening. I asked everybody to think about the number before she told us the 90. Is that what you were all thinking just by head movement, or were you thinking lower numbers or higher numbers? Again, you don't have to raise hand. I'm just sort of curious what people thought about her answer. I don't necessarily disagree. I'm just curious what people would have thought. Raise your hand if you think that's what you were thinking in that kind of range, the 90 number. Raise your hand if you think that's true. Well, Phil, you don't count. Phil, you don't count at all. Forget it. You're a loaded guy, so forget it. Okay.
Yeah. And it sounds funny, like the key has been, as you mentioned, the buy-in from the top. So there's only so much change that can happen from a grassroots perspective. So the executive leadership, the board have to buy into this as a priority in order for you to get traction in a business. Really
precisely, Sharada. And our board of directors, we actually presented to them, and we still do. When we were working on the strategy, they walked with us through the process. When you think about diversity, equity, and inclusion as a part of governance of a board of directors of a publicly traded company, or nonprofits for that matter. I do a lot of work with nonprofits as they look to diversify their boards, because often the communities they serve, they have no reflection of that on their boards. So that is critical. So it's governance at the top level and then throughout the organization. And this was not a 100-yard dash for us. You know, this has been a marathon, and it will go on as things shift and change, both economically as well as what happens within communities and as well from a diversity in the country.
And I do want to be sensitive to Connie. I don't want to cut off the questions, but Connie, we've kept you already.
Well, a couple more. This is good.
Okay,
I want to make sure that if there are questions that people want, certainly
okay,
I can.
Perfect.
Sharada, I have one, and it's based off of where Skip was leading with his comment about, would anybody have thought that, right? And the reason I'm going to ask this question is it's going to be something that FEI has to address from a communication standpoint. You need to be able to overcome the branding that you have from all those years of the perception, because perception and reality are two different things, right? So as FEI continues to do this very meaningful work and increases the diversity of the organization in the chapter, how do we probably communicate that well and brand? What would you recommend so that you can start to then, it's going to take time. It takes time to, you built an image of a certain amount of time. It's going to take a certain amount of time to overcome that image. What do you recommend? What are you doing at Northern Trust?
As I've said, we started with the basics, right? We looked at talent development. Where did we want to be? We knew how important it was to, if we're going to talk about this, what does your board look like? And we know that if you don't have diversity at the table, it's real difficult to advance that conversation, because if everybody around the table has the same experience or the same background, it's very difficult to get different perspectives. And so for FEI, you look at who is your membership? What are the goals of your membership? What messages are you trying to send? So we are very intentional without being false or making it seem like it's contrived, right? It's not the window dressing that when you're calling on a client, you have to do what I call the Noah's Ark of diversity, one of these and one of these. It is clearly, these are the people who cover your account because they are the best and brightest at what they do. And this is a part of what we do. This is a part of what we do. And yes, we still have work to do, but we have made significant progress, and it will continue. And it will be important for us to retain the talent as well. Because it's one thing to bring in diverse talent. It is another to nurture and retain that talent.
All right, we've got two more questions, and then I'm going to move us over to, and Rick, I saw yours pop up first here. How does an organization deal with an employee or employees who say, I don't get it, and or DEI is not important to me, let me just do my job?
We have accountability measures for sure. For those senior executives, there's accountability because we expect to see the change. But we also have, processes in human resources. If someone is practicing behaviors that are inappropriate as it relates to DE&I, there are consequences of that. If it is a person who just says, I don't believe it, I'm never going to believe it, once again, I can't change anybody's heart around it, but I can ensure or do my best to work internally, our team, that the systems and structures don't preclude the advancement of people who don't believe. And that's really where the courage part comes in, the accountability, whether it's in expectations or having a safe place for employees to talk about those individuals who might be totally against a view of an inclusive culture.
And then there's another one here about what role do employee resource groups play in building up DEI?
Yeah. Excellent question. We call ours business resource councils, and we have 11 of them. And they have been excellent at helping us drive strategy throughout the organization. We have them globally, and whether it's from a business perspective, as we think about how we want to approach certain communities, certainly it increases volunteerism, which can help drive engagement. Employee engagement is critical to us. We had 10 and we have 11 now. The 11th business resource council that we created was one that's called LIFE. The acronym stands for Living in Fullness Every Day. Because as we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, we know that beliefs drive a lot of behavior. We have clients in different parts of the world who have different beliefs. And so what the Life Business Resource Council allows our partners to do from different faith bases or other different ways of looking at that, it is not a religious group, but it talks about beliefs. So it helps us understand, what the traditions are of different cultures, how we can learn about those. It makes us more effective with our clients and with one another. They are critical to what we do, how we get that messaging in. And the final thing I'll say about that is one of the things that we've been doing with our business resource councils now is that they are now connecting with each other. So our Women Business Resource Council is Women in Leadership, but they then work with the other business resource councils. For Black History Month this year, we had our LGBTQI Business Resource Council partner with our Black Business Resource Council and to do a lot of work because it is important for us to understand all of the different ways that we are diverse. Intersectionality, it isn't just women or just being gay. How do all of those things work together to make us who we are, and how can we leverage that and create places where people can feel most comfortable delivering what they need to deliver daily to the firm?
And I think that's a great point, right? You are Black and a woman. You belong to both groups. And so there, that intersectionality, that crossover of how the groups connect with each other is really critical. Precisely. One last question to squeeze in here, because I think it's an important one. And we talked a little bit about this earlier, but to put a finer point on it, redlining, lending in historically Black communities has been a critical issue. What is Northern Trust doing, or how are you maybe influencing other banks that maybe do more retail lending to try to help address that in the community?
So Northern isn't a retail bank, but certainly we are still required to comply with the Community Reinvestment Act, or CRA. And what we do is, when I talked earlier about the community investment team, we're making investments in areas and initiatives that help drive affordable housing, education, wealth accumulation. So we make specific investments in that area. And we have significant investments in CDFIs, small business investment companies, that are making the kinds of investments in critical areas for us where we have a footprint that address those key issues. There are also several initiatives around the country. You may have seen some of those, and there's some work being done right here in Chicago, that whole notion of holding people accountable. But it is important to understand the historical context. It's also important to know that each bank might have a different strategy, whether they have a retail CRA designation or a wholesale CRA designation, different approaches or a strategic plan. That's the technical aspect of how you can do that. But knowing that those areas of affordable housing, health equity, education, All of those things are important. And so in our strategy, where our investments are, I encourage all of you to go and read our corporate social responsibility report. You can find it at our website, because in that we list all of the areas where we are doing our work. We talk about our ESG and investing strategies. So it's at northerntrust.com, and you can find our CSR report. And I encourage you to read that. And if you have questions, please do come back. That report is audited as well. So the data that you find in there, you will see that it has been work that we've been doing, and it's important to us strategically, and we report it publicly because that's important as well.